Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I'm looking at the advanced information for Summer 22 for Component 3A of A-Level Politics by Edexcel. So this is the USA unit, and it's a bit different from Component 1 and Component 2, and also the nature of the released information is a bit different because of the way it interacts with the different question types. So we'll go through and hopefully I can give you as much help and guidance as I can. So what will the paper look like? Well, there are various elements to the paper, and it's different from the 30-30-24 format of component 1 and 2. So in component 3, the first part of the paper will give you a choice of two 12-mark questions, which will start with the word examine. And in this, you should be looking at comparing the US and UK politics. Now, the two sections that are only picked out for this particular bit are 6.2.3 and 6.2.9. And 6.2.3 is compare and debate the following aspects of the US and UK legislatures, and 6.2.9 is the aspects of UK and US democracy and participation. So there are two questions and there are two bits that have been picked out that only do the examine bit of the spec. So that would make sense that they're going to be the two bits on there. Part B is another 12-mark question. There's no choice this time, and it will begin with the word analyze. And this is the comparison question for 12 marks, where you have to bring in the comparable theories. And the one that's come out on this is 6.2.5 and 6.2.6, which is compare and debate the following aspects of the UK and US executive branches. So this is Prime Minister and President and cabinets and all that kind of stuff. And in it, you'd have to use one of rational, cultural, and structural approaches, or maybe a little bit of all of them. So they're the first two sections. That's your first 24 marks. And then part C, and this is the bit where it's going to get more complicated, is you're going to do a choice of 2 out of 3 essays that were 30 marks each. They're going to start with evaluate the view that, and can be from the indicated parts of sections 1 to 5. And I'm going to go through all the indicated sections, parts of sections 1 to 5 of the spec. They are more likely than in components 1 and 2 to draw from multiple sections. I think there's a way we can narrow it down a bit and make a best kind of first guess of the kind of areas where the questions are most likely to come. But that is only guessing, and they might well use a whole range of different bits from different parts of the spec that they've highlighted in the advanced information. So to start off with, we're going to look at the part for the examine questions. So 6.2.3, compare and debate the following aspects of the US and UK legislative branches and the resulting impact on politics and government. And there's a video that I've made that go through that bit, and obviously you might want to also go through the various parts on UK Parliament and US Congress. And you need to be able to compare the powers, strengths, and weaknesses of each of the houses and the extent to which the houses are equal. So that's what the spec tells us what we need to, and that's what I've looked at in that particular video. So what might the questions in this section look like? Well, you might get something like examine how the powers of the US Congress and UK Parliament are different or similar or limited and different or different in similar ways. So you might get something on powers, you might get something on strength, examine how the strengths of the US Congress and the UK Parliament are different or similar. So in particular, for example, if you're looking at differences there, you've got the difference between the way that Congress can initiate a lot more legislation, and the way that it can block the executive. And so, again, there's lots of different bits in there. You might get something on examine how the weaknesses of the US Congress and Parliament are different or similar. And then you look at particular weaknesses in the UK and particular weaknesses in the US. And that might be on both houses. It might be comparing just one of the two. So you might be comparing the Senate with the House of Lords. So, and in that, if you're comparing powers or looking at strengths and weaknesses, obviously the Senate is much, much stronger than the House of Lords. Whilst if you were looking at it in terms of the House of Commons versus the House of Representatives, then the House of Commons has got a lot more power than the House of Representatives. But they vary in different ways, and you've got a different relationship with the executive and things like that. And then the relationship between the houses is different as well. So the relationship between the House of Commons is different to that of the relationship between the House of Representatives and the Senate. There are some similarities as well. So in all of that, one of the best things I would suggest that you do for preparation is that you sit down and go through these and kind of go, right, Okay, so these are the general areas that I could be asked about. So can I write about similarities and differences in terms of powers, strengths, weaknesses, and relationships of the different houses in comparison to each other? Can I then can I back this up with examples and from recent years that I'm going to be able to display this really quickly, and so you get it down so you can do this element of the paper as quickly as possible. You don't need introductions and conclusions, you just need to go through about 3 similarities or differences. Read the question carefully. If it asks you for just differences, just do differences. If it asks you for just similarities, just do similarities. So read the question very carefully. Make sure you've got a bank of examples about weaknesses, strengths, powers, etc. for both US and UK, and that this one should be fairly straightforward. The other section that will be appearing, I believe, in Part A is 6.2.9, compare and debate the following aspects of US and UK democracy and participation and the resulting impact on politics and government. And as again, on my channel, there is a corresponding video for this. And you will just be doing the examine questions. Again, you're looking at the different nature of the party system, so two-party system and multi-party system, the degree of internal unity within the parties, the policy profiles of the 2 main parties in each country, the debates around campaign finances and party funding, and the relative power, methods, and influence of pressure groups. One thing I would say is very notable immediately on this is that's a lot more stuff than the Congress one. So this could potentially be a really kind of nice question. It also has the potential for being a bit more difficult, and there's a lot more to go through and learn for this bit. And kind of this is illustrated by just as kind of starting point in some of this with potential questions on it. So examine the impact of the different nature or the impact of the similarities of the party systems in the US and UK. So in which case you'd be looking at things like the very much the 2-party system nature in the US versus a more multi-party system in the UK, but you might also argue that essentially the UK system is a 2-party system because you're only really going to see Labour or Conservative governments or prime ministers. You could talk about the fact that actually it's not a simple 2-party system in the States, because you could talk about it's a 50-party system or 100-party system because you've got the 50 different states and the lack of national control and things like that. The differences or similarities to the degree of internal unity within the parties. So you're looking at the factions in the UK and US parties. So you need to know the factions within the Conservative Party, the factions within the Republicans, the factions within the Democrats and Labour Party, and are they more united in the UK? Is that just a kind of a created by the different electoral systems and the way the 2 political systems work, or is actually are they more cogent? Are they close together? And the gaps in the different parts of the Democrats or Republican parties, as you go to the different regions in the US, can be quite significant. And obviously there's a lot of partisanship in both countries at the moment as well. You might look at being asked to look at examine the differences and similarities in the policy profiles of the 2 main parties in each country. Again, there's a whole vast range of things that on this you could be picking out, but looking at their different policies on welfare, on the economy, on all kind of aspects, on welfare, on social issues. So again, something where you might be comparing the Conservative Party and the Republicans, the Labour and Democrats, or any combination of those. And you might be looking at the degree of difference that there is between the 2 main parties in the US compared to the degree of differences there are between the 2 main parties in the UK. You could be asked to examine the differences and similarities in the debates around campaign finances and party funding in the US and the UK. So you need to know the aspects of that. And again, the party funding is a massive issue, particularly in America, with the gigantic amount of money spent, for example, in the 2020 election. But increasingly, there's been debate in the UK about it as well, with the difference between the Conservative Party and the others in terms of the amount of money that they can generate. And then you've got to examine the differences or similarities in the relative power and methods of pressure groups. So the effectiveness of pressure groups in the UK versus the effectiveness of pressure groups in the US, or it might be the methods. So there's a lot in there to get your teeth into. But again, this is something you can work through in in a fairly regimented way and go use the basis of what's on the screen at the moment and kind of go, right, can I do all of those? Again, make sure you're talking about US and UK. Make sure you've got examples from both to back it up. Don't need introductions, don't need conclusions. You just need to go through your 3 similarities or 3 differences or combination, depending on exactly how the question is phrased. Now, the second section, part B of the exam paper, will be another 12 marker. And this is the one where there is no choice. You have to do the 1 12 marker that they pick. Now, interestingly, there is only one of the sections of section 6 of the specification where this comes from, where they have picked out the bit on rational, cultural, and structural approaches, and it is this one here on compare the debate following aspects of US and UK executive branches and their resulting impact on politics and government. So what this tells us is that the question in part B, the 12-mark analyse question, where you have to use structural approaches, will be comparing the executive branches. Now, it tells us that you need to know the key similarities and differences between the role and powers of the US President and UK Prime Minister and their impact on politics and government, and the extent of accountability to the US and UK legislature. And then, of course, you got that bit, the bottom 6.2.6, the bit about the rational, cultural, and structural approaches. Now, depending on what the question is, will depend on which one of these is the most applicable. I mean, the obvious one in terms of role and powers is a kind of structural approach, because that's kind of set out in the 2 constitutions, or definitely set out in the American one anyway. Obviously, it's evolved and it develops over time with the UK. And there are cultural differences, and there are rational elements of it as well. So that is where we are with that one. So what kind of questions might that look like? We might get something on analyse how the roles of the US President and UK Prime Minister differ or are similar. So, for example, you might look at things like they both propose legislation, they both submit budgets, they're both chief executive, they both have the role to nominate executive officials, obviously more extensively in the US than in the UK. But the president has more roles and more powers than a UK Prime Minister, so they are head of state, they have the power of pardon, they sign or veto legislation, they nominate judges, all federal judges are nominated by the president in the US. So there is a definite difference there, but there's also some key similarities. And remember, there will be always at the bottom of this compare. In your answer, you must consider the relevance of at least one comparative theory. As far as I can see from the mark schemes, you can get right to the top of the mark scheme only using one, so you don't need to use all 3. I generally think it's a good practice to try and get in at least 2, just in case one of them goes slightly wrong. There is another video on my full A-level politics playlist on how to do the 12-mark questions and talking about this all in more detail. So the other areas kind of questions you might get analyse the different powers of the UK Prime Minister and the US President. You might get analyse the extent of accountability of the US President and UK Prime Minister to their respective legislatures. So that's, again, it's part of the spec. And again, these all form a good base. If you did look at the 3 on here, well, it's 6 really, isn't it? Because on all of them I've looked at either, you could do similarities or differences on any of them. And again, you might get one like that bottom one, which can be a mixture of the 2. The extent of accountability can be they're the same in this way, and they're different in that. So with all of these, just worth practicing them, setting out, making sure you're getting your relevant examples for both US and UK in there, making sure you are properly using and explaining the comparative theory. Don't just go, and this is an example of structural theory. Explain what structural theory is and why that applies to this. So this is due to the constitutional power given to the US President, separation of powers, all that kind of stuff, and explain why it's structural, why it's rational, why it's cultural, and that will then help you hit the top end of that mark scheme. Now, part C, the 30-mark essays. This is the bit where putting this stuff together was most difficult, because the essays here are not necessarily going to be fully straightforward, which you'd expect on A-level, really, I guess. So you're going to do a choice of 2 out of 3 essays. and you are going to, those essays you're going to be faced with will start with evaluate the view that. They can be from any of the indicated parts on the advanced information of sections 1 to 5 of the spec, and they are more likely than essays in component 1 or 2 to draw from multiple sections. So there are bits, and I'll go through them over the next period of time, of all the aspects. There are aspects of all the different bits of section 1 to 5 put in there. So and so we've got stuff from 5 sections. There are 3 questions, so they can't. Therefore, the 3 questions can't all just be individually on one section of the spec. Otherwise, there would only be stuff from 3 sections, which I'm sure many of you and I myself was hoping that there would only be stuff out of 3 sections, but there isn't. It's out of 5. So there must be some that have drawing information from multiple sections. So going back through some past papers, and you can see that I've seen questions that have drawn on both presidency and Congress and the Constitution. There was a question that it drew on the Supreme Court and on pressure groups. There's one that has stuff on elections and presidency and Congress and presidency and political parties. So it might not be completely straightforward. Now, there are some bits where there's some really key bits of the specification which have been either left in or left out of the advanced information, which might give us a bit more of a hint where the main thrust of some of the questions are going. But all the stuff in these next few over these next few slides is going to be really important. So we're going to start off with section 1 of the spec, which is on the Constitution, and 1.1 is in there, the nature of the US Constitution. There's a video that I've done on that, which is important that you, again, will help support your revision on it. And it talks about the vagueness of the document, codification, entrenchment, the constitutional framework and powers of the US branches of government, the amendment process, including advantages and disadvantages of the formal process. So that tells us you need to know the key bit of the Constitution and how it works. Now, actually, regardless of whether this was included or not, this is something I would definitely be guiding students towards making sure that you know, because unless you have the fundamentals of the US Constitution, it's very difficult to understand American politics full stop, I think. So this bit is important. Now, as we go through the rest of section 1, then you also have 1.2, the key features of the US Constitution, as listed below, and an evaluation of their effectiveness today. So federalism, separation of powers, bipartisanship, and limited government. And I have done short videos on all 4 of those bits. So there's lots of good stuff in there. They are the 4 elements of the US Constitution. So that means you might get a question that goes on separation of powers or bipartisanship, which if you're doing on bipartisanship, then that might well link to some of the stuff in section 5 on parties. So that would give us that bit where there's multiple bits of the question in there. A bit on limited government, and then that might help us. That might be useful if you're doing stuff looking at the way the relationship between Congress and President, for example. Now, interestingly, 1.3, which is federalism, and 1.4, interpretation debates around the US Constitution and federalism, have not been included. So this might mean that actually the stuff from 1.1 and 1.2 is just really helpful in answering a question. And it might be the Constitution makes up part of one of the essay questions or is referred to in one of the questions. So it might be that it makes up part of an argument, but it's the debates on federalism and Constitution are not in the advanced information. The fact that federalism 1.3 isn't in there would maybe mean that a question linked on federalism, even though there is a little bit of it in 1.2, is not hugely likely, but I definitely would not completely discount it. So well worth going through all 4 of those on the different aspects or different key features of the US Constitution. Now, section 2 of the spec is on Congress, and all of this has been included, which I think is really significant. So you need to know Congress in a lot of detail. So we have got the bicameral nature and membership of Congress and the election cycle. We've got the distribution of power within Congress, the shared powers, the powers that are are exclusive to the different houses. We've got then the different functions of Congress. So the basic structure of Congress, I've done a video on that, which also covers some of the stuff on distribution of power. On the function of Congress, on representation, I've got a video on that. So you need to know representation. You need to know the legislative power of Congress, the legislative process, the difference between legislative process in each chamber, the policy significance of Congress, impact on effective laws passed. Again, make sure with all this you've got as many good recent examples to back this up as you possibly can. You've also got oversight, factors affecting the relationship between Congress and the presidency, checks on the other branches of government, and the extent of institutional effectiveness. Now that checks on the other branches of government, that links into one of the bits that we saw on Constitution, doesn't it? So again, that might get you going, right, okay, so how does the Constitution check the powers of different parts of government? How does Congress impact on the power of other aspects of government in the US? And again, on each of these individual bits, I've done content videos on those different ones, so it'd be worth looking at those. So on the playlist that will be attached to this video, I will make sure all the videos that are referenced on there are in that playlist, so you can go through and use those as part of your revision. So 2.3 is on there as well, interpretations and debates around Congress. Again, I've done an individual video on that, and the interpretation debates it picks out in the spec are the changing roles and powers of Congress, and their relative importance, debates about adequacy of its representative role, changing significance of the parties in Congress, significance and effectiveness of the powers outlined in the Constitution. So again, we see that link and go, oh, right, well, that might be 1.1, 1.2, and 1.1 and 1.2 are in there. Maybe we're going to get a question about powers of different strands of government and link it to the Constitution. So the fact that all aspects of Section 2 of the spec are covered makes me think this Congress is going to be hugely significant. Congress will be in at least one of those questions, possibly more than one. It might be a straight Congress question. It might be combined with something else. So you need to make sure you know Congress like the back of your hand, that you have a big set of examples of stuff that's been going on in Congress about when Congress is powerful, when Congress is weak, when different bills and things that have been passed, the issues of gridlock, all that kind of stuff, bipartisanship, all that stuff, you need to know it all really well. Make sure you go through kind of bullet point by bullet point the spec, use my videos, use other resources and stuff that I'm sure you'll have, and build your knowledge on that. Section 3 of the spec is about presidents. It's about the executive. And in there, we've got 3.1, the formal sources of presidential power as outlined in the US Constitution and their use. So again, we've got a link between the presidential section and Constitution. So the role of head of state and head of government signaling of their power with reference to presidents since '92. So you can go all the way back to and including Clinton. I would always argue that the more up-to-date your examples are, the better. And again, there's a video on all these different aspects. On informal sources of presidential power and their use, I've done 2 videos on that. So you've got things on the electoral mandate, executive orders, national events, and the cabinet, powers of persuasion, and the presidential power to persuade is a kind of really significant power, and it just changed with circumstances depending on whether they're early on in their presidency, about how popular they are, how well they're polling. It also depends on whether you got divided or united government, all kinds of things like that. So there should be lots of good examples so you can get your teeth into with that, and you should be able to get examples from the different presidents. And then you've got the rest of the executive. You've got things like EXOP, with all its different parts, including National Security Council, the Office of Management and Budget, and the White House Office. And again, the significance that this all plays. And again, going back, examples going through Biden and Trump and Obama and Bush and all the way back into Clinton. So we've also then got other aspects of the presidency which are in there. So the relationship between the presidency and the following institutions. So its relationship with Congress, its relationship with the Supreme Court, and I've done videos on both of those. you've got limitations on presidential power, and it varies between presidents. So again, it's all the bits with the nature of the power in the term of office, and how you've kind of got the first 100 days is usually significant. The impact midterms can have, and then at the end you get that kind of lame duck bit at the end of the presidency. And again, we've got this bit, it seems to me, questions quite lightly, where you're balancing the power, talking about the balance of power between the different elements of government. So Congress, Supreme Court, Constitution, again in here, linking to some of the stuff that we looked at earlier. The electoral cycle, divided government. And again, it's telling you, again, you need lots and lots of examples. So interestingly, the 3.4 on interpretations and debates of the US presidency is not in the advanced material. But do remember, you do need to know the presidency really, really well, because it is the subject of the 12-mark analyse question, where you're going to be comparing against the executive in the UK. There is, however, plenty in what we've just looked at where you can see that it is talking about its relationship with the different branches. So if the presidency is in one of the essays, it might be something related just to the stuff we just looked at, or it might be that you're going to have does the president or Congress have a more significant, or does the president and the Supreme Court have a more significant, or does it evaluate the view that the Constitution rather than the president that leads the way on. So it could be any way of that where it's brought in. So make sure you know the material, make sure you know examples, and therefore you'll then have the ability to be flexible as you're answering your question in the exam to bring different things in. But you'll have the underlying bit where you've gone through bullet point by bullet point, bit by bit of the spec, and go, right, I know that bit, I know that bit. And then you can use it effectively in the essays. Now, section 4 of the spec is a big one, and so in this we've got some really kind of key bits, and then we've got some interesting bits missed out as well. So you need to know 4.1, the nature and role of the Supreme Court, the US Constitution, independent nature of the Supreme Court, judicial review process, so Marbury, Madison, and Fletcher versus Peck. You've got the Supreme Court on public policy, which again I think is one of the most interesting topics in American politics. So you've got the impact on public policy in the US with examples, including some post 2005, which means you can use some earlier ones as well, but you must make sure you've got some recent ones in there. And then you've got political significant debate, the role of judicial activism and judicial restraint, criticism of each. Now, there's loads and loads of stuff on that. So, for example, in my class, we've been talking a lot about issues such as abortion and things like that, where we're seeing a big debate over judicial activism and judicial restraint over that aspect in US politics at the moment. So lots and lots of stuff in there that you can bring to bear, and the focus of particular issues of debate, which makes good essay questions. And again, we can see in this reference to the Constitution again, which makes us, oh, right, yes, remember, this is why we needed to learn 1.1 and 1.2. Now, you then go on to 4.4 and 4.5. So this is the stuff on protection of civil liberties and rights in the US. And again, I've done a video on that. It's right protected by the Constitution, again, Constitution. Bill of Rights by the subsequent constitutional amendments by the ruling of the Supreme Court. Race and rights in contemporary US politics, methods, influence and effectiveness of racial rights campaigns, the impact on current domestic policy, voting rights, affirmative action, representation. Right, I think the inclusion of that one is really, really important, because unless they're going to ask on race and rights in the exam in some way, then that would be one that you could quite easily miss out. If it isn't directly in one of the questions, it's one where you could kind of go, oh, right, yeah, no, there isn't anything on race in contemporary US politics, so 4.5 we can miss out. 4.5 is in there, which makes me think something on rights, and particularly in relation to race, is very, very likely in the exam. And so we then get on to 4.6. So this is the big one, the interpretations and debates section. Again, I've done a video on this bit. Now, because the only bit of section 4 that is missing is 4.2, which is the appointment process of the Supreme Court. What impact does that have on the stuff above? It makes the political versus judicial nature of the Supreme Court is maybe less likely, because if you were gonna write about that, you definitely would talk about the appointment process, wouldn't you? Because I think you need to know the appointment process anyway, because it's good fundamental underlying knowledge. But if you were going to talk about the increasing politicization of the Supreme Court, then you would go through the appointment that's just happened under Biden. You go through the Trump ones, and you could talk about the kind of huge divide and partisanship over all of that, and how the Supreme Court has been made into a more and more political animal. A living constitution versus originalism is again a really good area of debate. And then we've got this next one. So the effective civil and constitutional rights have been upheld by the Supreme Court, and effectiveness of its protection, the extent of their powers and effectiveness of checks and balances, and then the success and failures of the measures to promote equality, including affirmative action and immigration reform. Now, the fact that we've got the bits of the spec left in there that directly relate to that last one and the one a couple above on rights and on equality and race suggests to me that that is a very likely area for a question. So that is something that I would be looking at in detail, making sure you've got loads and loads of good examples and good things to talk about on those ones. But it could be, again, any of the ones on there. Watch the video to make sure you've got the full basis of content on that one. Now, Section 5, there might be many of you like me who was hoping Section 5 would be touched as lightly as possible, because I haven't quite finished teaching it all yet. But you might well have done it all this much earlier. But this is one I was hoping was going to be touched very lightly, and it hasn't been. There's an awful lot of it in there. So you need to know about the electoral systems in the US, presidential elections and their significance. Again, there's a video on there about the process of electing US presidents, constitutional requirements, visible primaries, caucuses, national conventions, electoral college, and the resulting party system, the importance of incumbency. And there's also brilliant stuff you can get in all of that, particularly from the 2020 election, go back to 2016 as well, and beyond. There's loads and loads of really good stuff on that. So anything on elections would make a great question. You've got the stuff on campaign finances, which is just, I think, absolutely mind-blowing, the amount of money and stuff that's spent on that. And again, there's a video on campaign finances to help you with that bit. Then you've got the key principles of the Democrat and Republican parties. Again, there's a video on that. Distribution of power, significance of those parties. So you've got the Democrats who have got progressive attitudes on social moral issues, including crime. They generally push for greater government intervention in the national economy. They generally want greater provision of social welfare, whilst the Republicans are increasingly conservative, in particular in their attitudes on social moral issues. More restricted government intervention in the national economy whilst protecting American trade and jobs, or just protecting American industry, with all the examples under Trump, and the acceptance of some social welfare, but a greater preference for much more personal responsibility. So you need to know about all the different details on the Democrats and Republicans, and I'm sure, again, this is something that's really engaging and interesting. This is something that you'll all be completely across. The video on there will help. And then we've got the current conflicts and tendencies and changing power and influence within the parties. So this is the different factions. So all your different parts of your Democrats, I think your Blue Dogs, etc., and your progressives. In your Republicans, there's been loads and loads of interesting stuff over recent years, with the big schisms within the Republican Party and the use of the term rhino, Republican in name only, and what exactly that means. And you've got the pro-Trumpers and the anti-Trumpers, haven't you really, now in the Republican Party? And again, a video to help you on that bit as well. And it just keeps on going, Section 5, doesn't it? So we then have got the coalitions of supporters. So this is voting behaviour, essentially. So who votes for who and why, and all the stuff on race, religion, gender and education. Again, remember the race stuff was in the Section 4 stuff as well. Maybe we'll have connection here. Perhaps, or maybe it'll just be left in terms of the Supreme Court and rights stuff. So you need to study voting behaviour. That just involves getting your nose into loads of statistics about who votes for who and all stuff like that. One of the wonderful things like this is if you make some generalisations based on just some basic fundamental knowledge on it, you're probably going to be right. You just need to make sure you learn some facts and figures to back that up. So, for example, the Democrats do much better with ethnic minorities, but remember, it's not uniform. That these groups are not homogeneous, and therefore, for example, the split in the Hispanic vote varies from state to state. Depends on which part of the Hispanic vote you're talking about. Are you talking about Mexican Americans? Are you talking about Cuban Americans? All kind of things like that. So the evangelical right tend to vote Republican, the South tends to vote Republican, the seaboards tend to vote Democrat, the cities tend to vote Democrat, younger people tend to vote Democrat, older people tend to vote Republican, all kinds of stuff like that. Some of it will be stuff that you think, oh, wait, I knew that, but you just need to be able to back it up with some data. And then you've got the stuff on interest groups. So this is pressure groups. So significance, their resources, their tactics, debates on their impact, influence and methods, and you need detailed examples. So they talk about this in building a case study, and I'd have a couple of them. So I think one of the one I've used is things like the NRA, and it's just building a kind of a log or a series of examples you can use to show their influence, their methods, things like that. Definitely worth maybe picking up on a civil rights pressure groups, things to do with equality, because again of the fact that we've got 5.2.3 in here and also the stuff that we saw in section 4. So then we have got the interpretations and debates bit on US democracy and participation, including advantages and disadvantages of the electoral process. So they might give you a beautiful question on whether the electoral college is outdated or something like that. The role of campaign finances and difficulty achieving effective reform. Again, loads of stuff in the campaign section on the campaign finance section on that. The role of incumbency on the elections. Basically, if you're an incumbent, you should win. It is the shorthand of that. I think it's over 70% of incumbents win. The ways in which interest groups can influence the three branches of government and policy creation, including the role of PACs and super PACs and their impact on democracy. So you need to know all of that stuff. Again, there's a video linked there, and you need to make sure that you can answer questions on each one of those bullet points, because the whole of 5 there, isn't it? So all that stuff from 5. So it might be a straight question on one of those. It might bring in some of the earlier stuff, the bit that we saw, maybe not the entire sections of. So just to try and pull all that together, interpretations and debates in the advanced information are there for Congress. They're there for US Supreme Court and civil rights, and interpretation debates of US democracy and participation. So there will be 3 essays. There are 3 of the sections where the interpretations and debates part are in the advanced information. That, therefore, it might give you a really good starting point on one's right. I'm going to go through those 3 with a fine-tooth comb and make sure I've got tons of examples for all the debates that are brought out in those 3. I will then be aware that you need to know some stuff on presidency and the executive and the Constitution from the sections that have been highlighted in those that might well cross over into that. I would emphasize again, component 3 essays are much, much harder to predict. You need strong knowledge across all aspects of the specification that have been listed in the video. It is unlikely there will simply be a Congress, a Supreme Court, and civil rights question and a participation question. It might be the case, and they might just be they think, well, yeah, they needed that bit on Constitution because we've done a constitutional one out of the interpretation debate of something else. So you will need to bring in knowledge about the Constitution and the presidency to answer some of the questions, but you can quite clearly see in some of those aspects of those interpretation ones, it references the other bits of the spec anyway. So that's where I would start. So I hope that's been helpful for you. Thank you very much for watching. If you haven't done so already, then please do subscribe. There is extensive coverage of A-level politics on my channel, and also quite extensive coverage of various history units as well, as you would expect on Alan History Nerd. So subscribe if you haven't already. Please hit like to show your appreciation of the video, and if you have any questions or comments, then please leave them below. Thank you very much for watching.